Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Public Affairs exclusive webinar series, Insight to Impact. I'm Hannah Thibedeau, and in this episode, we are going to talk everything Trump 2.0 and how to be prepared for anything that may happen because right now there's a lot going on. Let me introduce you to someone who is following all of this extremely closely. Beth Burke, of course, we all know her. She is the CEO of the Canadian-American Business Council. Now, we have the next hour to have this really in-depth discussion, and I want to welcome people who are here as well. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat off to the side. We'll get those to Beth as well, because I'm sure you have quite a few with everything that's been happening. I think just since Monday, it feels like it's been weeks. But Beth, thank you for taking the time with us today because there is so much to discuss. Let's start with insight. You were at the inauguration. Not many people get a chance to do that. What was the feel and sense on the ground this time around?
There were lots of feelings. It's always quite a vibe. It's always a scene that I've been to three inaugurations in very different capacities each time. This was my first time spending the day of the inauguration at the Canadian Embassy, which was lovely. But it was a really interesting mood in the town, right? I got in on Saturday. I attended the cabinet reception, which was a rather large reception, but every member of the cabinet came. It was a good mix of people at the National Art Gallery. The vibe there was really festive, really exciting. People were wearing ball gowns, custom-made ball gowns in the American flag, and full tuxes and their MAGA hat, or cowboy boots and sashes. So it really was a
Even
celebratory
though it
tone
moved
there.
inside?
Yeah, well, I think that wasn't quite as felt on Saturday until we got a little bit closer. I think there was a lot of disappointment around the indoor move, to be honest. I mean, a lot of people that flew into town and spent quite a bit of money and time away to come to the event were no longer able to participate. They were expecting large numbers. I don't even know what they were expecting on the mall, but they had to downsize, right? So the only people who actually had tickets were the several hundred that they sat in the rotunda, which I think was around 700 people. And then they had 1,500 people in Emancipation Hall and the CVC auditorium, so the Capitol Visitor Center auditorium. And they are pretty far away from the rotunda. I actually think that kind of brings me to a point. I'm sort of moving off vibes, but
That's
one of the
okay.
things that I thought was interesting was there were a lot of feelings about where people's seats were, who got moved, where did the members of Congress get sat? Did their spouses get to come? And I think it's important to remember that while they are deep policy thinkers and legislators, they're still people. There is a very tough agenda. I wonder how that impacts, the ability to twist arms if people have frustration about where they were sat in
Can I
relation
ask
to.
you about that, Beth? Because we've
Sure.
seen in the media as well that row of high tech CEOs, and they were standing in front of even the cabinet members. What does that say about this Trump 2.0?
Well, look, there are always VIP guests that are invited who get prominent seating. I think based on the layout and setup in the rotunda, it was more exaggerated of where their position was. But I think, it does show what we've been seeing all along, that there are some unique voices, people, and roles that are going to have a disproportional say. At least we think so at this point. Everything is a bit of speculation, but I think that it says this is a predominant part of my kitchen cabinet, and these are voices that are important to me, and we wanted to give them a prominent position.
Yeah, that's something to consider for sure. I want to talk about so that was the feel just around the inauguration
Yeah.
itself, but also when he was signing those executive orders. I found this extremely fascinating. He had his marker there, he's signing the executive orders, but on the other side, what you may not have seen were the reporters who were throwing questions at him during this. Now,
Mhm.
One here in Canada that took everyone aback because we seem to have gotten a reprieve from the tariffs. But then in that press conference, it was Josh Wingrove from Bloomberg who threw out the question to him, okay, what about tariffs on Canada? He says, for Mexico, Canada, 25%. I think February 1st. Yeah, I think. So that's still in quotes, and there's still talk of that. What should we make of that?
Well, I think he was being very candid and just sort of off the cuff in those questions. Like it clearly wasn't a scripted or planned press conference. He just really was taking the questions in a very conversational manner. Um, there have been lots of speculations around the tariffs, and I know we're going to get all kinds of
Yeah.
questions about that. And I would say the answer is clear as mud. Um, I was hearing pretty aggressive, fast and furious rumors on Sunday night, what we should be expecting. It shifted again very early Monday morning. Then we heard the, definitely not. Then there was this pseudo announcement. I think the reality is every single day that we are given between now and something getting implemented is a gift and a responsibility for us in the business community. I take this on personally as a call to action to do our jobs, to share our stories, to make sure the impact is felt. I think there's lots of different factors playing into will they, won't they, what's the mechanism, how does this happen? And I think we are best served to take it seriously. But at the same time, I don't think anyone should put so much stock into any particular day or particular vehicle that they're hearing because it is shifting so rapidly.
And that's one of the things. I was talking to one of my friends here who hosts the program CTV's Power Play, Vashi Kapelos, and she's put in multiple calls to government ministers, the prime minister's office, and they learned about it from that press conference. So they don't even know at this point what will be implemented and when it will be implemented. So, how do you even prepare for something like that when it's clear as mud, as you say?
Well, I think, the Canadian American Business Council has been preparing for a long time. In fact, I would actually argue that just the principles of our organization is preparing, right? Making sure that you're highlighting and understanding the importance of this relationship. I spoke to a few different members of Congress throughout the weekend and into the week, even as late as yesterday afternoon, about what are they hearing, what are they thinking, what is the best messaging, and they all had little tweaks on the same thing, which is show the numbers, tell us the jobs, find the way to make someone understand. So find the hook that works for that person. So if you're talking to someone who has a large manufacturing base in their district, let's say, member of Congress, they would understand, oh, a lot of 70%, in fact, of what the United States buys from Canada is inputs. So we're buying things from Canada that we are then changing, altering, producing, processing, et cetera, into something else that we're then selling and making a profit on. That's really important for legislators to understand. I think, the question is what's the role going to be between the legislators and the administration? And again, that's a little clear as mud, but preparing is telling your story, getting your ducks in a row, making sure that your impact to the United States is exactly felt and quantified because this is about a US win.
Let
Donald
me be
Trump wants to win.
Yeah, let me be frank. There are a lot of businesses out there that maybe don't want to draw attention to themselves. And I
Oh, yeah.
completely understand this because I've been talking to businesses like, we don't want to put our hands up and say, hey, this is going to affect the American people for fear of repercussions from Donald Trump's administration. How do you manage that?
Well, I think
Hmm.
you get involved in as many different facets and many different ways that you can share your story as possible. Some of them are things like getting involved in trade associations where you can sort of be part of a voice that's advocating without fully raising your head, but being part of it. Some of it is, I think, going to be a call to folks to be a little bit brave here. I think we need to tell the story. If not now, then when, right? We we all realize how important this is to our businesses and to our cross-border relationship. We are in a moment where we could potentially be redefining that relationship. So I think being part of the conversation is always better than being on the sidelines. As people say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So I always say get to the table.
That's a great comment. I love that one. As a journalist, I would have clipped that one, Beth, for sure. Should there be a list from the Canadian government saying, here is where we're going to retaliate dollar for dollar? Because we are in a liberal leadership race right now. We've heard from Chrystia Freeland, who's in that race, that she would have had that list out now. I'm not sure how Mark Carney feels about that as of yet because I haven't seen him comment on it. But some of the leadership candidates in this are saying, yes, put a list out. For example, Florida orange juice, you're going to be dinged really hard. Wisconsin cheese, think of that as well. I know, I'm sorry, Beth, but I had to mention it. It was mentioned before. Kentucky bourbon, and we've heard freelancing from the premiers as well. The premiers are saying we'll stop selling alcohol from the United States in our liquor stores. That was both from Ontario and BC. What do you think of that?
Well, I understand the desire and the inclination for that. But from where I sit, I would rather not focus on the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs and all the negatives because I
Mm-hmm.
think this relationship is best when we are looking at the opportunities, when we're putting our best foot forward and saying, okay, let's talk about the ways we can collaborate. Let's talk about the areas that we work well together. Let's talk about the future opportunities to innovate and expand because we need to build and shape a North American economy that can be nimble and compete globally. So I would like to focus on the positive.
Yeah, we did hear from David Patterson, Ontario's representative in Washington, recently saying, two major trade associations are putting videos out, didn't name the associations, that show Americans how they will be affected by this because they can influence the president. It's
Yes.
really about that. What do you think of those, and what type of ideas would that, encompass?
I think it's extremely important to get American voices involved. I mean, I think, the more that you can share the story of the impacts in the US, the better off you are. I think it will motivate members of Congress, governors, state legislators. I think the game is at every level. So not just your footprint, but your customers, your suppliers, the more voices you can add to the table, the better.
We did also hear from former Ambassador Heyman, and a lot of people were saying in the first couple of days that we dodged a bullet. He says we haven't dodged it at all. But again, it comes back to what do we focus on?
Yeah, again, I mean, at the core of who I am, I'm kind of an optimist and I really like to look at things half full and I like to focus on this relationship. The Canada-U.S. relationship has evolved in many different ways over many different times, but it has not just survived, it's thrived because it has to. And I think getting to the core of that is really important, right? We share the longest demilitarized border. 400,000 people cross the border every day. I mean, I can rattle these stats off constantly, and there are people in the United States who it's brand new to, who they've never heard of this before, and making sure that it's top of mind and understanding how important it is really, really critical right now.
Yeah, and I think that brings me back to, as a communications officer too, one of the things, maybe those stats aren't sticking, but when it starts to affect their pocketbooks. So it comes back to those businesses giving examples, I guess. Is that,
Yes,
yeah?
absolutely. I mean, one of the things that has been very well sort of baked into those of us who live in this is the story of the car, that it moves back and forth across the border up to 13 times before it's completed. And the story of that and the tariffs that could be imposed on all the different layers of it going back and forth sticks. Lately I've been reading that people have been putting out the tariffs on oil and gas would be 70 cents at the pump for Americans. Those are important numbers because you're right. A huge issue during the election was inflation, cost, standard of living for folks here, and anything that shakes or threatens that really motivates people.
Yeah, and one of the things that I haven't heard from President Trump so far, and one of the big things he promised, was that cheaper eggs. I haven't seen cheaper eggs on day one. It's all a lot of, I'm going to say it like I said it in the past. He is an agent of chaos, and there's a lot of bluster out there. So we almost have to come back to what is the reason why he wants these tariffs implemented potentially on Canada, on Mexico? What is the reason why in your mind?
I mean, I've heard a lot of different reasons. I think if I had that answer, we would all wash our hands and be done. I mean, I think that,
Is it just to raise revenue so he can lower taxes for Americans? Is that the answer that we have?
that's definitely part of the conversation. Part of it is potentially reopening USMCA sooner. Some of it could potentially be just showing the strength of the incoming administration and, you know, showing wins for the US people. I think the idea of raising revenue is very important. Keeping the economy growing is really important. I mean, look, he has between 8 and 10 months to show that he can really do this. I mean, a lot of people are saying 18 months before the midterms. I think it's more like 8 to 10 months. And if the economy is not going in the right direction, it will be very challenging. I mean, the House has a one-seat majority right now. And so getting this very aggressive agenda through Congress is going to be tricky enough as it is. If the economy is not moving, it's going to be even harder because people are going to be fully in campaign mode for the midterms.
Oh, it seems like such, you think 4 years, but really, you gave the example of how long he has to get his golden era in place.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
so.
let's move on to the topic of energy, because that's one of the biggest ones that he was talking about in his executive orders. It's very complicated. One of the things among the plans he laid out on his first day and his directive was to abandon the shift towards clean energy and says more oil, more gas, more coal, getting rid of Biden's, wind power, solar power, six specifically executive orders related to energy. But in each of those orders, there are about a dozen policies in it. So, can he get those done in that short amount of time? Let's start there.
Well, it really depends. I actually think his declaration of the energy emergency is a huge opportunity. I think it's a huge opportunity for the United States, but I think it's a bigger opportunity for Canada. I think we know that about a third of what we import into the United States from Canada is energy in all different forms, not just oil and gas, but also electricity, all of it. And I think this state of emergency gives a real window to find ways to partner and to show innovation and partnership together. I think the question will become, is he going to use national security as the vehicle to move some of these policies through? And if so, there are more tools in the toolbox, if you will, to be able to do it quickly.
Can you
If it
go?
is
Yeah.
legislatively is the best way to have a long-term, lasting, predictable path for policy. That takes a long time. And if you gun to my head asking me like, what am I going to do? What are they going to accomplish in the first 8 to 10 months? A couple of things. I don't, it's not, they just don't have the capacity to move as quickly as they need to for some of the agenda that has been laid out. That being said, he can use executive orders and certain powers within the agencies of the federal government to exert some of the policies. And that's just going to depend on how that plays out, who's in charge, what congressional oversight is. There's just a lot of different factors. And so unless we drill down specifically on each one, I don't know that I can tell you exactly what the path is, but he does have options.
Let's talk about EVs because this one's really interesting. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying, I'm going to sign an executive order and it's done. Biden's tax credits are all authorized by Congress at this point. So that means businesses and consumers will still get those tax credits unless Congress revokes that money. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
Okay. So that's first. But the even though it is a majority Republican Congress, it's far from clear if Republicans want that because a lot of the manufacturing is in fact in red states. Can you go through that a little bit for me, Beth?
Sure. I
Yeah.
mean, I think I sort of alluded to this before when I mentioned
Yeah.
that they have a one-seat majority in the House, but there are divisions within the caucus, right? Both in the Senate and the House. It really depends on their district, their jobs, their production, how they're going to want to vote. I think the Biden administration did push a lot of money out the door right at the end. They appropriated or they moved the dollars so that it could sort of not be clawed back. And I think it's going to depend. I would expect, and I've been saying this for a little bit now, I expect the carrots to remain. It's the sticks that I think are going to get drawn back. And it's easier to do that from an executive perch.
Yeah, and for people in this sector, one of the questions is, do you expect companies both in the US and here in Canada to refocus when it comes to environmental sustainability, carbon emissions, those types of things?
Well, I think the market has moved and sort of speaks for itself in some of this. Consumers care, right? Traceability, sustainability, all of those things actually matter to consumers. And so I think that there are businesses that are going to continue with some of the programs that they've implemented because it's good for their bottom line. And I think they may shift the way they talk about it or the way that it's prioritized. But I think a lot of the policies that are in place may continue just because the market calls for it.
So just sum up what we were just talking about there essentially is it may be an executive order, but there are other factors at play here. There's Congress, there are Republicans who may have these EV manufacturing in their district, but also markets can dictate all of this as well.
Absolutely.
We do have questions, so that's why I'm looking down. I apologize to everybody. If you have more questions as well, because they're coming in fast and furious, Beth, this is something that is on everybody's mind. If we can keep, it's just following everything right now. We're going to talk a little bit, I'll mention of what Donald Trump said to Davos today, business leaders in Davos. But first, this is David Boodlewheel Lefave, and I apologize if I said your name wrong, David, but here's a question from David. Good afternoon. Thanks for setting up the webinar. It seems that Canadian provinces are willing to play the provincial diplomatic card to defend their own interests, either their way, Quebec, Ontario, each their way. Quebec, Ontario, and Alberta have done so. Do you see a chance those initiatives could be more efficient that a blanket federal approach, I think is what you meant, considering the lack of leadership in Ottawa these days? And says thanks. Not a tough question at all.
Yeah, no. I mean, look, I respect all of the players. I think everyone is trying to do what they believe is best to solve this problem. Every single Canadian that I've spoken to, no matter what their position, party, etc., really is focused on figuring out the best outcome. So my sense is the more people who are paying attention to it, the more people who are working through the problem, the better, right? Like it is good to build relationships and tell the story and highlight this relationship. I think domestic politics is not something I really want to like get too deep in.
Yeah, I love getting into that. So thanks for your
You feel
diplomacy.
free, Hannah.
Yeah.
You go ahead. You want to?
And of course, here's another one, and
Great.
I'll ask you. You'll see whether you want to answer it or not, because again, it's about domestic politics. Because it's more about the relationship, though, is maybe how we can keep it between this current president and 2.0. This is a political transactional administration. This is from an anonymous attendee. Thank you, anonymous. One thing that is clear is the president does not like our outgoing prime minister, Justin Trudeau. He also has a similar view of the former finance minister, Chrystia Freeland. How does this factor into the tariff issue, and will a change in government make a difference? And maybe we could talk about it. I know you don't want to talk domestic politics, but personality-wise and how Donald Trump manages personalities. And I'm going to say this because I'm not sure you want to, but he clearly did not like Justin Trudeau. He was out there taunting him for quite some time, trolling him on the internet after he came into power, and calling him the governor, and still calls him the governor. We still have the same thing with Chrystia Freeland. How does personality play with this administration, with Donald Trump, and how you can negotiate things with him? Because that's a big part of negotiating.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I think the thing to remember, though, is that Donald Trump likes to say provocative things in a very bombastic way to spark conversation and to spin the negotiation in his favor. So I think that's an important thing to think about as we approach everything that's on the horizon, because we've seen him do this before, right? There is a little bit of method to the approach he's taking, which is gaining the upper hand. He's a businessman who has negotiated and played hardball his entire life. And I think that some of this is just a factor of some of that positioning and posturing.
Do you think, with Pierre Polyev, he did say that he likes him. Do you think that relationship could potentially work in our favor as well? Because Donald Trump says he likes him. But let's be frank, Trudeau did get a meeting with him down in Mar-a-Lago, and I was pretty surprised to see he was sitting side by side that quickly with Donald Trump. So, what about Pierre Polyev? Do you have any thoughts on that, on the personalities and how he might manage personalities of Donald Trump?
So I think that Donald Trump likes to be liked and respected,
Mm-hmm.
and likes to work with people that like and respect him. And so I think that can take a lot of different forms. And I think, when people interact with him and work through negotiations, showing respect and, appreciation for the relationship is important.
That's a good answer. We have more questions, and I want to get to them because
Great.
they are coming in. This one is from Jane Peverett. Sorry, Jane, if I said your name wrong as well. Should Canada be spending more time pursuing the objectives of reducing the illicit drugs and the illegal immigration into the U.S. rather than retaliatory tariffs, which was the headline reason President Trump gave when he first started to talk about tariffs? So it was the border issue and the fentanyl problem.
I think it's important. I think that he was serious about talking about the problems and securities on both sides of the border. I think everybody knows that there is a difference between the northern and southern border, but I think that he takes it extremely seriously for any illicit activity. And I know that Canada does as well. So I think it's good for both countries to just dig in and find the best way to secure our countries. It helps each other and ourselves. So I think it's very important.
Is it important for Canada, though? One of the things that really didn't play up in the news, and you may not even have heard of it down there, is this big cocaine bust that happened in Toronto. It was actually the biggest one in the history of Toronto police. That cocaine came from Mexico, traveled all the way through the United States and into Canada. That maybe we need to ensure that that messaging is getting out, that it is happening here as well. It seems like Donald Trump has this storyline that it only goes down into the United States.
Yeah, I think I understand, and I think that that's known, but I don't know that that's exactly the most effective message to President Trump. I think I think he wants to just hear we're all fighting in strong and we're doing everything we can together, because he really cares about national security, which moves to defense spending, which moves to all these other issues that sort of are on the table in the relationship. And so I, my read for working with this administration is showing that we're all working together and caring about the same cause instead of pointing fingers is going to go the furthest.
Yeah, and one of the things when he asked for more security on the border, the federal government pledged $1.3 billion, but then you also have all the provinces saying we're going to put more resources at the border as well. So Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario, they unilaterally went out and said, hey, this is what we're going to do. Does he hear this? And is that the real why as to why we're getting, this threat of tariffs? I know I'm probably
I
asking
wish I
you.
could tell you the answer to that. I wish I had a crystal ball or was a mind reader. I would love to tell you that. But, I think it was really important, and I found it really impressive how quickly Canada responded to that call. I think everyone sort of took it seriously and made big steps. I think it is well received. My understanding is there is chatter, on this side of the border that things are moving and happening, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think that is really important. It actually is neat to hear that the chatter is happening on the other side. Look,
Yeah.
they are moving. Here's another question. David McLean, how similar or dissimilar is this scenario to the steel and aluminum tariffs in Trump's first term? And should Canada's tactics be the same or different? Should we learn from that, use similar tactics, or is this a completely different administration?
I think a little from column A, a little from column B.
Yeah.
Um, we should always learn from every experience that we go through. And I think, obviously it was tariffs is very important playbook that we learned and we worked through. But times are different. The world is different. The makeup of the American people is different. The understanding and, the pro-trade mentality has shifted a little bit within, the United States. So I think it all comes down to educating and making sure people are aware. One of the things I talk about a lot is that USMCA, NAFTA, all of these things has really set the table for really good North American collaboration. And it's not perfect, right? There are things that need to be addressed and tweaks that can be made. But ultimately, I think that touching things that move us backwards or take us backwards is never really good. We should be building upon what we've learned and done. So, sort of roundabout answer, yes.
Yeah.
That's kind of
Well,
what.
coming back to the USMCA, CUSMA, wherever you stand, we
Oh,
couldn't even
sorry. Yeah.
agree on a title for it. No, that's okay, Beth. You had mentioned earlier that maybe, and again, it's clear as mud, but let's talk about it because we're trying to figure things out here, that part of this tactic is to renegotiate CUSMA for Donald Trump. CUSMA was the one, he did this. This is
Did.
his baby. Couldn't we say, you did a great job? And
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. But, again, the world has changed. We
Mm-hmm.
now have seen how things play out. He also always wants a win, right? That is something we know to be very true about President Trump. He wants to win. He wants to show that America is bigger, stronger, better, all of these things. And so, there has been some chatter that that is a possibility why this is floating out there. Um, and that the sooner we move to do this, the sooner it sort of could resolve some of these issues. I mean, my read is that implementing these tariffs are in stark opposition of this agreement and that it would trigger action. So whether that's his goal or his intent or goal or not, I think that would be the outcome.
Yeah.
So being prepared, which is something that I know my members and a lot of the business community have been doing for a while anyway. So like maybe we just get into it and figure out where, the push and pulls are.
Let's go to another question, another anonymous attendee, but thank you for attending, Anonymous. Elon Musk is wielding a lot of influence given his close relationship to Donald Trump. Should Canadian politicians include engaging Musk in their strategy? That's a great question.
I actually joked earlier this week that uh, we should try and get him to go to Canada, get him up
Well,
there.
his mother was
Have-
from Canada, right?
I know, but I mean, spend some time, see what's going on, dig in, enjoy. I mean, look, I think that engaging everyone and anyone in his orbit to hear the story is a great thing. You know,
I, I like
it,
that idea, Beth.
One of the other things I just think is worth mentioning, which is not one of the questions, but speaking of Elon Musk, sort of
Yeah,
makes me think
please.
about Doge and all of this government efficiency thing. I think something that's important for Canadians to think about is, you know, the federal government structure and dedicated staff that focus on Canada-U.S. issues is stretched anyway. And if we lose a bunch of staff that have institutional knowledge and understanding of how the Canadian system works and the dynamics, that is a loss for the relationship. So I think it's important to factor in what could be potentially happening with the civil servants in the United States and how much focus and time and attention there is from the staff to be able to tend to these needs. So for me, it
Sorry,
gives me a little bit of
yeah,
sense of
sorry.
urgency. Yeah,
Just for clarity on that, are you talking staff in the United States? They're losing.
correct. Yeah,
Okay.
so the Department of Government Oversight and Efficiency, or whatever DOGE, whatever
Yeah.
thing it's called, is focusing on slimming back
Yeah.
civil servants in the United States who work in federal government. And what that means and the implications that it can have for Canadians is real. And so to me, it just gives a sense of urgency of engage now while there are still people in those seats.
So let's go on to another question too. They're rolling, and this is from Glenn Rollins. Thank you, Glenn. Do the two countries have the customs infrastructure to manage broad spectrum tariffs, or would the result be chaos and congestion at the ports and borders? With that, so there's a second part. With that in mind, would implementation be stepwise instead of all at once?
Well, to be determined. I mean, I've heard multiple things.
What do you
Uh,
hear?
I've heard, that they were originally going to do blanket tariffs. Then I heard that they were going to do 2% and incrementally increase. So it was sort of like a frog in the water boiling thing. But I don't know. And then from an implementation perspective, it really depends. This is all sort of clear as mud again.
Yeah.
I think to answer your question, I'm not sure. It depends on how this is rolled out. It depends on the timing. It depends on who's collecting. There's a lot of different factors that are yet to be determined. So I just
And
don't know.
I guess we have to wait until February 1st if hopefully, it won't happen, but if it does happen, that we might get more clarity in that. Because he did say, and I'm going to come back to, he said, I think that's the date.
Absolutely. I mean, I
And
wouldn't put stock in that day over any other day, frankly. To me, it feels like there's a lot of pieces that need to be figured out. One of them is the vehicle of implementation. There are lots of different, very weedy, wonky, specific tools that they could use through the government to implement tariffs, but some have limitations on how long they can do without congressional approval. Some are, longer processes, et cetera. So it just depends.
here's another question. It's from Francis Bradley. Thanks for the great overview. Francis says, do you have any suggestions for overcoming U.S. partners' reluctance to publicly support the trade relationship benefits? That's what we are talking about. It seems more challenging than it was when NAFTA was renegotiated. Valid points, Francis. What do you think on that?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, the sentiment in the United States has shifted over time, and I think it was extremely clear in this election that American citizens are very much putting sort of that protectionist America first vibe is very important. I think the very loud pro-free trade movement in the United States is quieter than it was before, but I think it's still there. And I think it's about finding the right allies and finding the right story. And I think we touched on this earlier, but I do think tweaking your message and understanding the messenger is important. Sort of aligning those two things is going to be critical. Making sure that you have a story that fits and is personal to whoever you're speaking with, is going to matter.
Yeah, I think we teach that in communications too. Know your audience first, right? I'm sitting here
Exactly.
going, yes, Beth, that was excellent. Because you have to know your audience and how to engage that audience and sort of figure out how to get what you want out of them.
Mhm.
Okay, Catherine Major. And here's some more strategies. Maybe you can pick up on that too. So, Catherine Major kind of asks that. Thank you, Catherine. What strategies would you recommend for Canadian business community to strengthen collaboration with U.S. businesses on shared priorities?
Well, I mean,
Strategies, yeah.
that's sort of our bread and butter at the Canadian American Business Council. That's what I do every day, right? Is make sure like that we're talking to each other, that we're aligning, that we are sharing our stories, that we are making sure we are speaking for both sides, that we really take a bilateral lens. And I think that's really important. So to the point of the first question and this question, I think finding a way to marry the two perspectives is extremely important. And it isn't just this will hurt at Canada because I don't know that that will, you know, necessarily take hold with some members and some folks who are part of this administration, but really, what does it mean to the US? How is this going to impact the US? What does this mean for the security and stability of our economy, for our borders, for our national security? I mean, what I've been hearing for a long time is that national security was national security. Then it was economic security as national security. Then it was supply chain security as national security. It really is all of the above. And you hear people from both sides of the aisle talking about things in that way. And so I think framing whatever your industry feeds, food security is national security. All of these things can be spoken in that through that lens. And I think it's extremely useful down
That's
here.
yeah, that's some really good advice, Beth. Here's Jen Patterson. Hello, Hannah, and thank you, Beth, for your insights. This is Jen Patterson from EPAC. I have two questions, both related to energy. Beth, do you have any insight you can share about the pressure that President Trump might be getting from U.S. refineries and LNG shippers who would not want to see major jumps to their input costs related to tariffs being placed on oil and gas coming from Canada? And then she has a second question. I'll get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pressure is coming from every side. So I know people are speaking out, and again, I think I alluded to this earlier, maybe I said it, that 70% of what we buy from Canada is inputs in the United States. And I think that is very real for the customer base down here, is that they know they're turning it around and selling it for profit, and that really matters. So I know that the voices are speaking out, and they will continue to do so, hopefully
Uh,
louder.
Hopefully louder, absolutely. And this one is actually to me, Beth.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Your
thanks, Jen.
turn.
My turn. And Hannah would be interested in your assessment of why we are now seeing Canadian politicians, Premier Moe and the leader of the Bloc, coming out in public, aligning with Premier Smith's position that Canada should not use export tariffs on oil and gas as potential retaliatory tariffs. I think what they're trying to say here, and I would have to, think about it a little bit more, but I think what they're trying to say here is that they want everybody to speak with one voice when it comes to speaking with our American neighbors. Because if you start going off on different tangents, and this is something that the federal government is having problems with right now, because they are in a leadership race, they're focusing on that, and then trying to be the voice to Donald Trump is very difficult for them at this point in time. So I think what you're hearing from the Bloc leader, the other provincial leaders, is saying, and because they're saying that maybe they align with this, they need to get in a room together and not go out with all this scattered messaging. Because once Donald Trump starts to see cracks, and maybe Beth, I can get you to jump in on this one. Once he sees cracks, he will take advantage of those cracks. And that's what he's doing right now. I know by him talking, he's had discussions with Danielle Smith one on one. Maybe they were shorter conversations, but she's down there. She's having those discussions because this is important to her province. It is critical when Canadians talk, they need to talk with one voice. And that's something we've heard from everybody. Beth, you want to jump in on that?
No, I think you said it well.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay, thanks. Let's get this back to you. Here's another anonymous attendee. Some Canadian trade policies are more friendly to China and result in easier access to the broader North American market for items already defined as subsidized and dumped in the United States, but not in Canada. Is there a focus on syncing up Canadian trade policies with the US regarding China in particular? And if yes, do you see an organized approach to this? That's an interesting question. It might be something
Yeah,
that
I mean, I think we've
towards.
seen steps towards that, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Canada's got in line with the U.S. tariff and focusing on the EVs, I think there is some alignment here, and I think there's some conversation. I can't speak to it because I haven't been part of them, but I do think that Canada and U.S. aligning against, potential adverse actors or other players in the field is important, and I think will be seen as an asset in the conversation around the way that Canada is a great partner to the United States. So the more of that, the better.
Yeah, you could even see maybe that's a pitch that Canada should be bringing forward to the United States because we have heard the concerns about dumping from China in the past. Yeah.
No, you're right.
I want to ask you about something else. And this is the president ordered a massive blow to diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in federal agencies with these offices and programs being shut down. And I did have a question from one of our clients on this one. And it kind of comes back to, should companies be rethinking strategies? Should they be rethinking those strategies when it comes to, and, you know, using language, DEI language, if they're working in the United States? And we started to get into that type of discussion, but maybe go a bit further.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it kind of comes back to what we were talking around the market versus the policies here. I think there is a desire in the United States. Consumers are loud. They take their voices and they care about, who they're buying from and what they're doing. I mean, we saw that with I don't really want to get into this, but we saw it with the TikTok ban down here, and that people were, instead of signing up for Facebook and Instagram, they were making these red note plays. I mean, people were trying to organize and do things that were um,
Constituents' voices matter.
provocative. Well,
Yeah.
and provocative to speak out about things that they thought that that they didn't feel good about. And so I think that that plays into this conversation, right? Like DEI matters to people. And I think maybe you just don't necessarily use the same terminology when you're speaking with the government or, think through where it falls on your prioritization list. But I think it matters. And, you know, it will continue to matter because the markets will call for it.
Let me ask you something. And this just happened, maybe an hour ago, maybe a half hour ago, and I was talking to you before we got on here. But President Donald Trump was talking to business leaders in Davos at the World Economic Forum. And I'm going to bring it back to a Canadian lens again,
Mhm.
because he said, we don't need their cars, we don't need their lumber, we don't need their oil and gas. Can I just get your response to him, that quote first? And that's a general quote.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, again, I think it kind of goes back to what I said about he likes to make comments to stir conversations and to make big statements and be provocative. So, I think he is making a point that he wants everything to be America first and we can do it here. I think the reality of that is maybe different than what he is projecting. I mean, I definitely think it's different than that. I think we have become so integrated and so connected that I just don't think that's true. But I think he's probably making a larger statement about how he wants to put America first. So,
Okay. Uh,
um,
just want to remind people who are watching, and I thank you for joining us today because it's a great opportunity to have interactions with Beth Burke. If you still have questions, we have about 10 minutes left. If not, I still have a lot for you, Beth. So I just want to remind people that they can put those in. What do you think in the next coming weeks? And I know crystal ball at this point in time is very foggy. My crystal ball's foggy. Every time he stands up to talk, I'm like, oh, okay, I got to throw out everything I thought before. If you were to say to businesses, here's what you need to focus on in the next, let's just say 2 weeks, because things change.
yeah, I think you need to make your priority list of figuring out what's the most important to you and to your business and that you need to be advocating for. I mean, I think there's real opportunities here, right? Deregulation is something that President Trump is really outspoken about. The window to do quick deregulation is small, right? He has a window when he first comes in, and there's CRAs to pull back. Sorry, it's a mechanism in the Senate that they can pull back some legislation that
Mhm.
that are all within a short window when he first takes office. After that, even deregulating has a process and takes some time here. So I think we need to be thoughtful about where the opportunities are. So what I would do, and what I'm suggesting people do, is to make a list, like what it will be the most impactful to your bottom line and to increase your customer base and to increase your jobs, to figure out, okay, this is where I'm going to target. I also would strongly advise that we don't need to react to every single comment and every single tweet. I think it's a lot better to come from a place of strength and calm than it is reactionary panic. Um, So instead of focusing on some of the noise, I think being focused on your agenda and what you want to accomplish and who your allies and advocates can be is the most impactful thing you can do right now.
So, talking about regulation, one of the other things that he was talking about in that messaging to the world leaders, which was smart, I'd say, he's like, invest here because we have cheaper taxes and easier regulations. Can you respond to that? The taxes thing, here in Canada, I've heard business leaders for a long time say getting through dealing with the different layers is very difficult. Make
Yeah,
investment easier.
yeah, I mean, I think that also speaks to one of the big items on his agenda, the tax bill that needs to be addressed before the end of the year, or a bunch of tax cuts will expire, is very much live. The conversation of how they're going to navigate that is obviously rolled up into all of these conversations about the vehicle of reconciliation, or if they're going to use regular legislation on the floor, or how they're going to be able to maneuver this is an important one. But ultimately, the goal is keeping tax cuts in place. I mean, I've heard all different numbers about what he wants to lower the corporate tax rate to, and there need to be offsets for that unless you do
What numbers are
deficit.
you hearing? I'm sure our listeners would love to know the numbers you're hearing.
I mean, I've heard a couple different, as low as 12%. So,
Wow.
it's pretty dramatic. But again, there has to be an offset for that. So where is that revenue coming from? Uh, The pay fors are yet to be determined. Is it tariffs? Is that part of the play here? Very unclear because
And
it also depends on how the government here will score the pay for. I'm sorry, I'm getting too wonky weedy, but
no, no, no. You know what? It's not too wonky weedy. These are the things that our Canadian companies really love to hear and to get
okay.
insights. Absolutely. No, we appreciate it, Beth. Here's one from Stephanie Haas. This one's good. For the health and life sciences industry, what changes can you expect to be made under the Trump administration, where Robert F. Kennedy is set to lead the Department of Health? How should industry respond in light of these changes? Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would anticipate deregulation of a lot of things. I think removing parameters that have been historically there is definitely in the agenda. I think the best thing to do, again, is sort of what I said about like figuring out your best 3-point strategy or sit whatever it may be about what will be the most beneficial to you and pitch it right off the bat. Get in front of people who are going to be helping shape the agenda. The transition teams landed a few weeks ago. I mean, they really got in pretty late. So a lot of the conversations around handoff within these agencies are a little bit slower than they were. There was so much activity this week. I was meeting with a couple folks in the administration on Tuesday who were like, literally, it was day one of their new bosses and teams coming into place. And everyone's trying to figure out where the bathrooms are and the light switches are. So we still have a window to sort of get your messaging and your agenda in. And I think I would recommend that being your first step is trying to just get to know the players.
What's that window, would you say? Like time?
I think it depends on the agency and it depends on confirmations, and all of that is also going to sort of depend on, the Senate schedule. But there are a bunch of people who will get appointed who are not Senate confirmed level who have a lot of power. The other interesting thing that I actually think, I sort of take away from my time when I was in the administration is that there are a lot of people who put a ton of stock into titles and levels within the administration. But I have seen young, somewhat junior level staffs get a lot done because if they are an advocate and an ally and they really believe it, they may take the ball and run. And so I think it's important to not discount different opportunities to engage with people that may not be the secretary, the assistant secretary. There are some people who are really, they know the agencies, they know the ins and outs, and they may be more effective than some of the higher level people.
That's a really great piece of advice, Beth. Another anonymous attendee. We're going back to environmental issues here. What do you make of the executive order banning offshore wind? What does it mean for Canada's marine renewable energy industry and the businesses in the supply chain? It's a good question for sure, because he is not in favor of solar and wind.
Yeah. But I think we'll see. Time will tell. There are a lot of very important business leaders who were sitting with him throughout the weekend that also have investments or care a lot about those things. So, I think we're some of these bans and statements are not implemented yet, right? A lot of executive orders are basically an intent to do something. And we need to remember that there's a lot of time from saying that this is what's going to happen to figuring out how it actually will happen. And again, there's a lot of people around him that may not necessarily be totally aligned. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
let's point that out again as well, Beth, because executive orders are essentially directional documents. This is
Press
the
releases.
theme. Press releases.
I
Yeah.
shouldn't say that, but kind
No,
of.
no, but it's to, help people understand like it's he's sitting there and he's signing them and he's holding them up and you think, okay, this is now law, but there's a lot that comes after that. Can you just give us a sense from signing that executive order to when we know exactly what will happen?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what the executive order is, what it's directing, how many people are involved, how long the implementation may be. I think understanding clear lines of jurisdiction within agencies is also important, and some of these orders that I've seen blur some of that. So there's going to be jockeying for who's in charge, which has happened on a lot of key files. I mean, we saw this in the Biden administration where the critical mineral file was one that was like sexy, and every single person and every single agency thought that they were the lead for the administration on it. And it got really messy and opaque. And so I think that can happen too from some of these. So instead, I think figuring out who's in charge of what the lines are is going to be really important. And so it depends, but I mean, it's not, none of this is going to be tomorrow, right? It's going to take time.
I think that's a really key thing to mention because in the media it looks like okay, it's automatically done, but there's a lot of mechanics behind it and I think the mechanics are quite fascinating as well. We have about 3 minutes left and Beth, I want to give you the chance to give your final thoughts on, everything we've had a chance to discuss today and really give a sense, and we already did maybe in the next couple of weeks, but overall, what do you feel this administration will be like to deal with?
I think that, and I've said it a million times, but I'm going
Mm,
to keep saying it, is that the Canada-US relationship is so important and so interconnected and so intertwined that it is going to survive. So I feel like coming from that perspective is a really important grounding one. And I think realizing that this relationship is bigger and broader than any relationships on any side of the border is going to be valuable to maybe take a pause and a breath. Um, I think there's going to be a lot of different opportunities, and that's what I'm trying to focus on. Where can we innovate together? How can we become more nimble together? How can we face the world's challenges together? That is going to be that is going to resonate with this administration. I think delivering wins, clear wins to Donald Trump is going to be extremely important. I think as a business community and voices that speak for the people from a very populist movement in our election, I think that is also really important. So activating as far, into the grassroots as you possibly can is going to be important. Having people speak out is going to be important. But ultimately, I am optimistic. And I am going to seize every opportunity that we have to keep driving the ball forward and to advance our relationship and show and highlight where we work together.
I
And I
think
hope
that's
everyone on the call does the same.
yeah, I think that's a really positive way to end this. And I like that. Beth Burke, I want to thank you, CEO of the Canadian American Business Council. You are our first guest in this exclusive webinar series, Insight to Impact. You definitely gave us the feel of what that insight to impact will be of Trump 2.0. Thank you for your time. And thank you, everybody, for joining us and asking such great questions. If you have any further questions, feel free to send them to us and we'll get those answers for you. We all appreciate your time. Beth, thank you for taking the time today.
Thank you, Hannah. It was a real treat.